the stock market. I mean, it has been okay in a sense, given that it has risen this year.
I think my view on the market in general is probably a different view from most people who come on the channel. Most market moves are largely just sentiment driven, that's irrelevant to the underlying value of the businesses.
In fact, I don't think that would be that different a view to most of the people on the channel. I seem to have heard that, repeated throughout the year, that this is all about confidence, these markets, and that some of the companies should be, invested more in, but people are just unconfident, if that's a word, and others perhaps shouldn't get the benefit of investors.
In a sense, I guess my views in a general sense, though, is if you look at market, is the market up 10% or down 10%? Well, ultimately, it's irrelevant. Market moves up and down based on various investor whims, and then they're usually wrong. The market, in the long term, the market is a weighing machine. In the short term, it's a voting machine, as Benjamin Graham said. So I haven't owned a share in about 4 or 5 years. I was short the market when it was 6,800 and my super's 100% cash. So I'm not particularly confident in general in shares. That's obviously not my advice as a professional investor manager, but that's my advice on a macro level, looking at where Australia sits and where the global economy sits. It's been held together by, if you look at the US and Europe, and ultimately you can look at individual shares sort of bottom up, and there's some great individual buys, but overall, talking macro or talking globally, the risks seem to be far more on the downside than the upside. And you've got the US frantically printing money to meet its deficit. The only way it can keep its interest payments under control is by keeping interest rates low by printing money. You've got Europe, which is a complete basket case. You've got Australia holding on desperately while Asia seems to slip. So overall, it wouldn't excite me as an investor in investing in most shares. You might get the odd really well run company through exceptional management, and certainly there will be some of them, but that's the exception rather than the rule, I would have thought.
David Manch, you in here, what are your thoughts about this fiscal cliff? I mean, at the moment it appears to be a mess, but as we know with the American political system, they usually try and get to something, even if it is really at the almost the 12th hour.
Well, the whole notion of the fiscal cliff is quite maddening. Even if, let's say they went off this so-called fiscal cliff, you'd still have the biggest deficit that was ever recorded other than since 2009. So even this so-called fiscal cliff and this adjustments in tax revenues and reduction in spending isn't even that much of a reduction. It's still, the budget isn't balanced. To take a leaf out of Gina Rinehart's book, you can't live beyond your means forever. And the US, even after this fiscal cliff, will still be living beyond their means. So fiscal cliff or not, it makes no difference. The US has to get its house in order. It has to drastically reduce revenue, drastically reduce expenses, which largely will need to be reduction in military expenses, which is a substantial part of the US budget. And also, there's a lot of health costs on there, and they've got to increase taxes as well. So without a substantial increase in taxes and reduction in expenses, forget the fiscal cliff. The US is on a road to hell, and there's nothing's going to stop it unless they can balance this budget.
Yeah. Company news. Adam, I'll start with you. I mean, IAG finally sort of announced its exit from the UK. It's been a painful, kind of ugly period for it. How did you view this? Because it went into the motor industry insurance sector, with great hopes. It's been incredibly costly. There's still going to be, $240 million worth of losses out of it. How did you view the exit?
I think this is a great example of agency costs and the cost that the cost that shareholders have from bad management, and why any Australian company tries to tackle Europe. Every single one has stuffed it up. Harvey Norman stuffed it up. IAG stuffed it up. NAB, well, we know what happened there. $1 billion stuff up. Every single one doesn't get it right. Yeah. So effectively what they do is they try and go to Europe, they try and boost their earnings because their Australian earnings have presumably levelled off, and if it goes well, executives get a great bonus, and if it goes badly, well, the next person has to fix it up. And that looks like what's happened here. IAG has bitten the bullet, as they should, taken a write-off. The person who was responsible was long gone, got a termination payment, got some great bonuses along the way, and IAG shareholders are holding the can. The same as NAB did, the same as Harvey Norman shareholders have.
Yeah, all right.
And Village Roadshow as well, for that matter.
Yeah, David Manch, you're killing yourself laughing.
Yeah, because I totally agree. And I mean, I think that it comes down to, and we see, it doesn't matter whether it's those companies, the banks, the financial companies, but other companies as well, resource companies, etc. I don't know what it is with Australians or anyone else that thinks that we can go to the other side of the world and pick up an asset that we're buying cheaper than what the Europeans know, or the Brits know, or Americans know, and then we can think we can run it better from the other side of the world.
But in a sense, why shouldn't we be able to do that? Everybody else does that when they look at stuff here to invest in or buy.
Yeah, well, that's when the Japanese came here and built all our golf courses, and then left our nice golf courses and lost all their money. And it's a similar sort of thing. So I just think it's not as easy as people think that you can just go, right, well, I'll buy this asset, this business in this particular market, the other side of the world, because that market's growing. On a macro perspective, we're going to make heaps of money. It's never that easy. And you don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of business culture there, or how things work there, or the markets really. You have to sort of work within a market for a long time to understand that. So I think sometimes we have, unfortunately, shareholders have really borne the brunt of this. Is we've underestimated the risks of going into new markets.
Yeah, Adam Schwab, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned that it wasn't current chief Mike Wilkins. It wasn't his sort of fault, and he was left holding it all. As Business Spectator Steve Bartholomew's pointed out, he said, it cost his predecessor Mike Hawker his job, and has been a major and consistent blemish on the results that Mike Wilkins has presided over.
Absolutely right, and agree with David as well. I think part of the reason, just exploring that a bit further, as to why Australian companies think they can do well from these overseas assets, many of the Australian companies operate in oligopolies or even monopolies here. If you look at almost every industry in Australia is some sort of oligopoly or monopoly. Look at the banks, look at the supermarkets, look at the insurance companies. So they have this comfy little sort of cartel in Australia, not in a legal sense, and they go across to the UK when as David said, they have no idea how the market works, and they haven't got this oligopoly, and suddenly they're competing with real market forces, really shrewd competitors, especially in the US, especially in the UK, and they get trounced every time. And if I was a shareholder, as soon as I see a company buy an overseas asset, I'd sell it. I'd short that. I'd sell my shares. I'd short the company because you're guaranteed to make a windfall.
All right. Well, just a minute. What about ANZ? Because their whole strategy, Adam, is as we're going for the Asian strategy. It is paying off so far, but they have bought up some local banks in Asia. Excuse me.
ANZ have tried this before and it didn't work. I'm guessing this won't work as well, and Mike Smith will be long gone with $50 million in his pocket. And
stop it, you cynical thing! Really? You reckon it's not going to work?
Well, ANZ paid Mike Smith a sign-on bonus, and we can talk about Brian Hartz or any sign-on bonus. I don't think any shareholder's not getting value when they're getting a sign-on bonus because you're paying for somebody else's.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? We'll get to that in a minute, but just let's stick with IAG for a sec. Adam, I mean, I could say to you, at least they've stopped the bleeding.
Absolutely. It's a smart decision to stop it, but it's a pretty easy decision. When you and I'm no doubt that the private equity mob they've sold it to will do a lot better than IAG have, and will probably sell it for double or triple in a couple of years' time. But that's simply a fact of the fact that a big Australian public company almost certainly isn't run well. It's even run worse when it's done remotely from 20,000 kilometres away. So selling it is the right decision. And I also feel sorry for Cameron Klein in a sense, and we can discuss NAB later on, but he's got the same situation, and same with Michael Chaney. They're dealing with this legacy Clydesdale Yorkshire bank that was bought well before they arrived.
Yeah.
And people blame Cameron Klein for this. Well, Cameron Klein's and NAB's made some pretty big mistakes, I think, but that's certainly not something you can pin on Cameron Klein. This is a legacy asset that he inherited. All
right, well, let's talk about, because I want to get on to the bank AGMs, and that included NAB and Westpac and Bank of Queensland, but let's jump to Cameron Klein. I mean, there was shareholder angst around his pay packet. I mean, his slightly improved pay packet, but plus this sort of inability to get out of their UK operations, which, as you say, he admittedly, when he joined, it was in the throes of the GFC in, January 2009, I think he joined. But how much is that a serious failing, Adam, do you think, of Cameron Klein? Although from what you're saying, you don't blame him, that he hasn't been able to extricate NAB from that mess in the UK.
I actually don't blame Cameron Klein for that at all. if you buy a house and the house has termites in it, you don't blame the subsequent owner for the termites. Like, ultimately, it's...
No, but do you stay there for 3 or 4 years? 3 years?
The question is, has that asset depreciated in that 3 or 4 years? Who knows? I'd say probably not. It's probably just as lack of value now as it was 3 or 4 years ago. And I think 3 or 4 years ago it's probably even less valuable because the banking sector was worse off.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can blame at all Cameron Klein for that. And it actually annoys me when I see people blaming him for that. But what we can blame Cameron Klein for is NAB chasing market share in the last 2 years, offering discounted, and they've been the cheapest of the banks in the mortgage wars in the last 2 years. They're chasing market share. They're chasing market share at the wrong time. They're chasing market share at the end of a property boom. That's not the time you want to increase your mortgage book. This is the time when you want to shut down your mortgage book. And
so did you say property boom? What property boom are you talking about?
The one I talk about every week, Helen. So
I know, but has there really been a property boom? I thought everyone's been talking about depressed prices in housing in most capital cities in Australia.
Well, housing's gone off maybe 10 or 15% in some places and steady in others. But if you look at, I think I wrote an article a couple of years ago for Fairfax, if you compare housing to any number of metrics,
yeah,
but housing to income or housing to rent, and it's double or triple, it's about 40% overvalued, or overpriced, I should say.
All right, sorry, I did. Okay, I did interrupt your thoughts, your train of thought about you know, the NAB and the housing. Continue.
No, it's not at all. I think your question is exactly right, and it relates to Cameron Klein's performance for what he can control, and the NAB breaking up campaign and they're chasing a market share has been done at the wrong time. So we won't really know the implications of this probably for 2 or 3 years, but it's highly risky for NAB to be chasing this market share because they've got, look at the loan arrears and loan defaults. The worst loan defaults are the ones that have, the loans have been made since 0607, so the recent ones, and they're the ones that NAB have been chasing.
Yeah, well, that's
so
interesting.
They've got a much riskier loan book.
Yeah, that's interesting you point that out because, in fact, their profits have plunged, something just over 20%, and not all of that can be sheeted home to the UK debacle. A lot of that is because of sort of, you know, troubles in some of the loans here.
Absolutely. I guess the bigger notion of Cameron Klein and everybody's pay is, and seeing a bank executive getting paid $8 million is actually sickening. Not because...
not because you and I are not getting paid that, but go on.
Absolutely not. And some people deserve a lot of money, and we don't sort of begrudge of that, but a bank executive is little more than a glorified politician and part-time capital allocator. They don't create any value. They effectively deal with investors and maybe deal with a bit of media, and that's it. They're no different.
They need to protect value, don't they? I mean, I'm going to bring David in here. What do you reckon?
Look, I don't disagree in some ways. I mean, I don't think... I mean, they're obviously smart people and they should be paid well. But when you hear those sort of figures, personally, I think it's a much easier job running National Australia Bank as the MD than running Rio Tinto or BHP.
Why?
Well, because you're operating an oligopoly. You've got depositors that give it to you, you pay 3%, and you lend it out at 6%. And if you're lending it out to businesses, you lend it out at 8%.
Yeah, right. And so you should be able to make money on that, is what you're saying.
You can't make money on that. And then you tinker around the edges with these. You get some, you have Boston Consulting in there every second week, telling you what you should do with your strategy, and you say, oh, maybe we'll do a bit of a marketing push on a breakup campaign. You know, I'm a genius, and it works or it doesn't work. But you're tinkering around the edges anyway. So there is that. I think there's that, and that's the resentment that's coming out of these shareholder meetings when they're saying, well, righto, look, we think you're overpaid, but we can handle that if we're actually getting some money.
Exactly.
But we're not getting money.
All right, so that came back to the shareholder angst that came out at the AGMs this week, and particularly NAB. What did you take from some of these?
I actually took them as being very uneventful. The fact that we're even just talking about Cameron Klein's pay is probably typifies the fact that they were actually uneventful. Westpac, etc., pretty well said, look, we don't expect things to get too much worse or any worse, so don't expect to go through the roof. So it's just business as usual.
Yeah.
I mean, they were better prepared, I think, this time too, in talking about their capital, etc. So their positions of the balance sheet. So. I think they probably gave... There was nothing exciting about them either way.
OK. Adam Schwab, interestingly, I mean, NAB Chairman Michael Chaney very much publicly is standing by Cameron Klein. I think he said he did he's done a first-class job. How did you feel about that AGM?
I've always liked Michael Chaney. He did such a great job at Wesfarmers and a good old school, and he understands return on capital. But I'm disappointed that he's simply fallen in line with the other bank chairman and just gone with the flow and allowed a massive payout to a CEO who could really probably isn't contributing more than $1 million a year for what he's doing. As any, harking back to my last comments, as any executive does, that they don't create real value. They can perhaps move capital here and there and do bits and pieces, but harking back to what David said, the hardest jobs, in terms of ASX listed companies, is running a media company. That's a tough job. Or running a retailer, that's a tough job. And I feel for someone like Sally McDonald or someone like Bernie Brooks, and they're hard jobs. Running an oligopolistic bank, it's impossible to not do it. It's impossible really to stuff it up and be seen to have known to stuff it up straight away.
All right, Adam, I just want to ask you briefly about Westpac. And Gail Kelly was, as David mentioned, she said she's not at all confident about that banking conditions are about to change any time very soon. But some analysts are getting a little nervous about Westpac's loan books because of the drop-off in mining activity and the high Aussie dollar. You know, according to Merrill Lynch, they are a bit worried about this spike in bad debts and lower earnings.
Because this harks back to the whole question of the macro economy, and the banks have had a 20-year golden run from, I guess, when it was the early 90s when Westpac was on its knees and there was that capital raising. And since then, none of the banks have basically barely put a foot wrong if you look at the dividends paid and the share appreciation, but that's been on the back of huge credit creation. And with every credit cycle, there's got to be a bust cycle. And when there's a bust cycle, the banks, who are really inherently insolvent institutions, can really feel it. So it has been a golden run for banks. It could continue. But eventually the music will stop, and you don't want to be holding the can when that happens.
All right.
As people saw in the US.
I just want to talk one more issue very briefly before we have to go to a break, and that's BHP's Browse transaction. Now, they're selling their stake, or they've sold their stake in the Woodside Petroleum-led Browse LNG venture to the Chinese oil giant PetroChina for something like 1.63 billion US. Adam, do you see this as, I mean, BHP, I think, said it was supposedly sparked by its long-term opposition to the relatively controversial placing of it at James Price Point in the Kimberley. But do you see that this says anything at all about BHP's long-term view about LNG and that whole sector?
Well, it's hard to go. I would have thought that an energy asset, be it LNG, be it shale gas, should theoretically be valued or have a similar... BHP should have a similar bullish view on one energy versus another. So if you're bullish about shale gas and Marius Kloppers investing $2.5 billion or more in the US, why would they be selling an Australian asset, which is essentially an energy asset as well? So ultimately, everything BHP does recently has been wrong. So I'm sure this will be wrong as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's, having said that, I think it's consistent with what it is they've been saying sort of for the last 6 months, and they've been warning about the higher costs and the delays in Australia. In this case, they're a minority stakeholder in it. They had got some issues with where it was going to be onshore, offshore, and I think that they're saying, well, righto, let's just exit this and concentrate on our bigger projects in the US.
Yeah, OK. We are going to take a very short course. The drama and the debacle, I guess, the scandal surrounding Southern Cross Austereo's 2Day FM. Adam, what was the... I mean, really, there's so many impacts on so many levels, but let's look at a sort of a corporate side of things. The impact on the bottom line and the brand and reputation of Southern Cross Austereo or 2Day FM from, you know, they cancelled the ads before the advertisers bailed on them, and then I think they brought back ads, but, you know, they're donating it to charity. There's been talk around that they could potentially lose their licence over this royal prank call scandal. They've had to hire extra security to protect their own workers. What did you make of all this?
I think Southern Cross Austereo's got bigger problems than this financially with its Channel 10 affiliate. That's probably where its real financial problems lie, because their bigger business almost is they run the Channel 10 regional affiliates, and Channel 10, as we know, is a complete basket case. So that's probably that bigger problem. This is obviously a tragic event with the death of the nurse. I think there's been mistakes made, but I think it's been grossly blown out of proportion, attributing back to Austereo. This could have happened to any number of radio stations.
I know, but nonetheless, it has had an impact, or it is having an impact on their bottom line.
It is, but I think if I was an Austereo shareholder, you'd look at, well, that's presumably a short-term event, a short-term hiccup, and I'm very doubtful they lose their licence. What's a bigger problem is their partner in regional TV, Channel 10, you got a former owner, Lawrence Freeman, who doesn't think they're even able to survive.
Yeah,
so that to me would be a bigger concern.
Yeah, David, how's your view? I'm going to ask you about the market, but I'm going to ask you if you can sort of nominate a highlight or a low light for you of 2012, either a story or a scandal or an issue that really caught your attention this year. I'm putting you on the spot on this because I haven't given you any warning of that. But are there a couple of issues that you thought really stood out?
I think for mine, being I guess in the tech space, that the Facebook story has been really fascinating. Obviously, hit the boards at that huge premium. And then got absolutely smashed down to, obviously hit the boards at 40, went down to about 18, I think, at one stage, now bounced back to $28 a share. It's been a fascinating story. I guess from looking a bit deeper, Facebook, really what Zuckerberg's principles were with Facebook was he ran it not as a business, but almost as an experience. And he wanted users to have a great experience, and revenue was always secondary. And obviously being a public company, that's not the way. And seeing the way Facebook's changed, and Facebook's famous news feed, which is always based on sort of algorithms on what your friends like and what your friends do, has been replaced by sort of hidden and secret ads so instead of being really a useful tool, it's been an advertising tool, and they've done that by stealth. So the Facebook story for me...
So, sorry, that doesn't please you as much because you think it's by stealth?
Not at all, because it's contrary to what Zuckerberg built Facebook on and what made Facebook great, being so relevant. And when you're replacing what your friends are thinking and doing with advertising that's been paid for by a third party, rather than ads on the side, which obviously what Facebook has and what Google has, it's akin to Google's organic search results, including paid results, really. It's sort of been a secret little thing that Facebook's done and nobody's really picked up on.
Yeah.
And I think the Facebook story has been, for mine, the story of the year, given its size, given it's one of the biggest floats ever.
All right.
And what's happened since.
That's great. Well, look, we